Welcome to week one of our online class, like officially straight up online class. What a weird year we have had thus far. Not that we have any choice in the matter, but I appreciate you rolling with these changes. Please know that each of your faculty will likely be developing and operating their online classes slightly different from one another. I'm one of only a handful of faculty in the college itself who's ever even taught online. Most of the people are old guard and have been very hesitant or reticent to even believe that online education is a real thing. So it'll probably be more difficult for those type of faculty in the weeks ahead to figure out this transition and actually do it well. That's a whole different story. But I have taught online classes for the last decade, so I'm pretty comfortable with it, which also means I can absolve or manage some of your anxieties. So if you have questions, fears, clarification, just feel free to email me and reach out, and I'll get back to you. But this week, we're going to turn our attention square on to the work of Emily Towns in her book, Womanist Ethics and the Cultural Production of Evil. And so in this mini lecture, what I wanted to do was provide just a little bit of background and clarification into the title of her work, and then more specifically into the main concept that she's going to be providing for us in chapter 2 of the reading for this week. So we did a little bit of biographical work on her a couple of weeks ago, if you can remember that far back, but pull out those notes and try to remember who she is. One of the areas of scholarship that she's working in and through is what is known as womanism, and I think I may have mentioned a little bit of this in our classes, and that was womanism is a type of feminist, or it comes from a feminism standpoint, but is going to be it's going to be somewhat different based upon location, social location, and some other things. So first wave feminism is what we get in the 1920s and teens and 20s that bring us the suffrage movement and women's right to vote. Although if we're honest about the women's right to vote, when that suffrage laws were passed, it was really only meant to apply to white women's rights to vote. And so one of the things that when womanism comes on the scene in 1996, wanting to take seriously black women's experiences specifically as a valid epistemological starting point for making sense of or understanding the world and the issues that are specific to that people group, womanism comes on and wants to assert itself as just making the basic claim that black women do have a voice that is legitimate, that doesn't have to be filtered through white men or white women scholars in order to be understood as legitimate, but that it could stand on its own 2 feet. And 1996, although that was probably prior to when many of you were born, really was not that long ago in the larger scope of human history. That was a very recent thing where black women are finally being taken seriously on their own terms to do their own scholarship in the way that they can legitimate without having to, like I said, filter it through the normal or normative sources of power in the academy. One of the things that's also different from that makes womanism different from white feminism is, especially in the work of Emily Towns, she's not interested in only looking at women or black women's experiences as a source of knowledge. What she's looking for is the intersection of how black women's experiences impacts and relates to black men's experiences, impacts and relates to issues of gender more generally, and sexuality more generally, and orientation more generally. And so what we have here is this sort of like womanism as this field of study that's meant to be integrative and bringing all of these different important facets of our lived social life into the same conversation. So at no point is she trying to delegitimate any other people's identity markers, but wants to bring those things into conversation to show them in their complexity. And yes, she will look at gender specifically here for a while, and she will look at issues of race over here for a while, and issues of class over here for a while, but ultimately she wants to bring all of those into the same conversation, because these are the areas that help determine our social world. Does that make sense? So that's the womanist part of womanist ethics. And remember, ethics is the study, the philosophical school of study that's looking at moral behavior. So morals and ethics are different. Ethics is the academic study of, or let's put a matrix around the moral behavior here so that we can try to make sense of it and have parameters in the ethical part of it here to make sense of and to base our behavior and our decision making in the moral realm over here. So they're not the same, although they are related. Okay, hopefully that makes sense as well. So she is a womanist ethicist. There's a lot of stuff to say in there. And she's looking at the cultural production of evil. So if you think for a few minutes, and normally I would do this on the whiteboard with you all, of the varying or the variety of things that we produce as a culture. Right? So mass culture is definitely one of these things. So the fact that we have a Taylor Swift is something that our culture has produced and is now out there for the rest of the world to enjoy, to consume, however we want to say that, right? McDonald's is a cultural production of the United States as well, right? It's a mass culture expression of and contribution to our lived social life together. But outside of the mass cultural productions, we have local or folk cultural productions as well, right? So music oftentimes, before we had Taylor Swift's, before we had the internet, before we had radio, right? Music was always produced locally, and that was their contribution. So this is why you could travel to New Orleans and have a different feel in the vibrancy of the music down there than you get in Alabama or that you get in Seattle, Washington, for example, right? So why is it that Seattle can produce a Nirvana and New Orleans can produce a Louis Armstrong? I don't know if he's from New Orleans. I know he played in New York and Chicago a lot. Well, whatever, regardless. But we have these differences, right? Because the different smaller cultures are producing different kinds of things that are the expression there of their own particularities in those geographical locations. So those are cultural productions, right? Large scale and small scale. But we do have what she's talking about here is she's talking about not generally things that we produce as a culture, but the evils that we produce as a culture. Not just produce them, but perpetuate them, and how our evils are woven into the very tapestry of our life together. Legal, cultural, social norms, interpersonal development, and then even interpersonal, not interpersonal, but interpersonal development. How do I see myself, right? So it's really easy to define in our own minds evil as being something individual to the, or particular to the individual. So evil is a bad moral act, for example. Emily Towns does not define evil in that way, at least in this book. She defines evil. She did this in person here in Denver 2 years ago when she came into town and gave a series of talks at DU. I had dinner with her beforehand and had a chance to talk through some of these issues with her before. And she defined evil at that point like this. She said, Evil is structural. Evil is embedded in the fabric of the life that we live, the common shared life that we live together. And that's if that's the general parameter around which she's defining evil. More specifically, she's saying evil is when society steps on your throat and then either wonders why you're crying out or blames you for crying out. So when society steps on your throat and then blames you for crying out, or says it's inappropriate for you to complain about this, this is just how it is. That's how Emily Towns defines evil throughout this entire book. It's a structural thing. It's not an individual, personal, moral failure. It's a large-scale, systemic, embedded in the very air that we breathe, which makes it so difficult to see and identify, and let alone to root up and change. But she's wanting to do that, and so she'll spend the next middle chapters of this entire book giving us some specific examples of the type of evil that she's talking about. So we'll see that next week when we get into the chapter 3 and 4, I believe they are, with the Aunt Jemima caricature and the sapphire image. So that's sort of the title of the book, Womanist Ethics and the Cultural Production of Evil. How is it that we as a society produce these sorts of evils? And then how is it that womanist ethics can respond to or give us insight about those evils? So hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. Now I'm going to move into the last part of this little talk, and that is to unpack a term that she uses in chapter 2. She draws from a couple of scholars, this guy named Gramsci, a guy named Michel Foucault. She looks at a couple of other people like Pierre Nora and other things. You'll see those names in that chapter, Maurice Halbwach. But she uses the phrase, the fantastic hegemonic imagination. Fantastic hegemonic imagination is this creative world that makes the evils that she will identify real in the lived experiences of certain people. So fantastic, that word is fairly self-explanatory, comes from the term fantasy. If you think of like Disney's Fantasia, right, that's all in there, where this weird sort of like psychedelic dream state, although it's not always psychedelic. But that fantastic is that realm of fantasy where we're creating and playing with ideas and concepts and putting them in unique ways together and trying to make sense of things. So that's that fantasy, right? Created by the mind. Hegemonic. This is a term she gets from the scholar Gramsci. Hegemonic, this is going to be an important term in the work of womanism as well as in the work specifically of Emily Towns. Hegemonic is a dominant group not impressing. A dominant group asserting its dominance over a subdominant group. That's part 1. Part 2, in asserting its dominance, it has to convince the subdominant group that it's in their best interest that they are subdominant. That's hegemony. Look it up, Wikipedia. Use the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. You'll find hegemony in there as well. But the hegemonic idea is it's 2 parts, right? It's that we are dominant over you, but it's in your self-interest that we are dominant over you. And so to the degree that we can convince you that this is true, then it is true. But it's always with respect to power, unequal power relationships. So it's not in your best interest to be the powerful. This is something that politicians always sort of fall trap to. Continue to hire me or elect me as your politician. It's in your interest. You're not smart enough to think about the law and policy, so let me do that for you. And I will do it for everyone the same regard. Well, whatever. So, and then the imagination part is tied to the fantastic part, right? The degree to which we can keep that fantastic hegemony alive, embedded within all of the different structures of the things that allow us to operate our lives in the ways that we do, from our laws to our food systems, to our interpersonal relationships, to issues of racism, issues of gender inequality, all of these things, right? They are kept alive in our imaginative world that we make into living, breathing policies that we then require us to live by. So she's going to unpack throughout this entire book that phrase, or give us examples of it. Here's an example in the Aunt Jemima syrup pancake mix people, how the fantastic hegemonic imagination is at work. And why is it that this is a nationally, what does she say? The first successful national marketing campaign that they were able to sell the same pancake mix to former slaveholders after the Civil War, to the people who were enslaved, and it's on the same tables, right? That's the hegemonic at work. So do what you can. Please engage all of the questions, please engage the discussions this week. Remember, Monday is our due date at midnight for your first discussion post, which is you and the book, the text in front of you, engaging and responding to one of the discussion prompts that I've posted. And then by Wednesday, let's have some actual dialogue and conversation back and forth between each other in our discussion board, where you can reply to other students or reply to the students who have replied to you. Any way that we can kind of generate a little bit of conversation so that we can together see if we can make sense of the work that Emily Towns is bringing to our attention. Thank you and have a good week. See ya.